What's up guys, welcome back to GabrielGaProd. This time I created a poll on my Patreon page and my patrons voted the most for the warp drive / hyperspace effect. So that's the one we are going to see today. And I think the end result is quite interesting actually. It's a similar effect that we can see in Star Wars, but we are going to add a little touch, why not? And every time I press spacebar, I activate the warp effect and it stays active for as long as I hold the space button down. It's a quite interesting effect. We are going to use VFX Graph and Shader Graph as well as some code. This whole project is available on my Patreon page, the link's in the description in case you are interested in getting access to this and much more visual effects and shaders for your games. So let's see how we can recreate this effect. So first off, I'm using Unity 2020.1 with the Universal Render Pipeline and with Shader Graph and VFX Graph installed in the package manager. Then we can start by clicking with right click in a folder, and in Visual Effects we can create a Visual Effects graph that we can then drag and drop to our scene. You can press F in your scene window to focus on the VFX graph, and then we can press this edit button to open the VFX graph. I'm gonna duck it right here and make some room, just like this. Now, the idea is to start by changing the texture to the default particle that comes with Unity. This one will do, and we can switch the blend mode to additive, because we don't want any dark colors. Now, we are not going to need this set velocity random module, so let's delete it. And let's actually increase the capacity to 10,000 and set the rate to around 100 for now. Now, in the initialize particle, we want this to start in a circle position. So we are going to use this model right here, and then we want to shrink the radius of the circle to around 0.2. This is going to be the smaller end of our cone. Now, in the update particle, we want this to continuously go towards a sphere. So we are going to use a conform to sphere module. And the idea is to increase the radius to around 3 or 4. And we can offset the center of this sphere to -1 in the z axis. And as you can see, the particles are starting to form a cone shape. If you want to make it longer, you can play with the radius. I'm going to leave it at 4 for now. Now let's control the size of this particle, so let's use a set size that we want to be random, uniform, between 0.01 and 0.08, more or less. And nothing happens because the set size of our life is set to overwrite. We want this to be in multiply in the composition. And now it seems like we don't have anything, but we actually have, if we get closer, the particles are just tiny. So let's change this curve to this one. You can try other ones if you want, that's fine. Our next step is to stretch these particles, which will give the sensation of speed. So we are going to use a set scale module that we also want to be random, uniform, and the idea is to shrink it in the x between 0.1 and 0.4. As you can see, they are already stretched, and then we want to stretch them in the y between 1 and 10. But as you may notice, they are not facing the right direction. They are not following the cone shape. And that's because in this model, the orient model, we are using face camera instead of a long velocity. We want the particles to be aligned with their velocity vector. Right, so as you can see, we are starting to see something, which is nice. Let's actually increase the rate to around 1000. And the perception of this effect is mostly influenced by the camera position. As you can see, the camera is close to the end of the cone, as you may notice. So what I'm going to do is push the warp speed VFX that I have on my scene forward in the z-axis. And in our game view now it looks much better. We have depth. So I'm gonna push it until I don't see the circle that the particles are creating at the end. Now let's add a few properties like color property. And as you may notice, we have a set color of a life. This is fading in and fading out the particles. We actually want to use a set color and then connect the property. But the particles don't change color because the set color of a life is set to overwrite. So it's overwriting any previous value. We want to switch it to multiply in the composition. And now let's change directly the color in the VFX graph that is in our scene. My color picker is a little bit but I'm going to increase the alpha and then choose a yellowish white color, something around here. And the idea is to increase the intensity so it becomes brighter. As you may notice, I have bloom in my scene, so that's why they are so bright. You can create one with right click down here and then add bloom. Alright, so it's starting to look really nice. But if we want to use this inside our game, we need to have a control over the warp amount. We need to have control when we activate the hyperspeed. So let's create a float that is going to be called the warp amount. And it's going to be a range between 0 and 1. 0 is no warp and 1 is warp, well, fully active, right? So let's drag it right here. And the first parameter we want to influence, it's the rate. So let's multiply it like this. My B option is going to be 1000 like I had previously. And as you can see now, the slider will have control over the rate amount. And we want to repeat this trick with the attraction speed, which is set to 5 in my case, and with the attraction force as well, which is set to 20. And as you can see, now every time we activate or deactivate the warp, we get this nice feeling. So let's see now how do we use this with a script. Let's create one. I'm gonna call it warp speed tutorial, something like that. And let's open it up. Right, so the first thing we need is a library. So let's say using unityengine.vfx. So we can then create a public visual effect variable, call it warp speed VFX, which is our VFX graph that we created. And then we want to say that every time we press the space bar, get key down, the first frame, we want to set warp active to true. And warp active is a private boolean that we can declare up here. And then we want to start a coroutine, call it something like activate particles, just like this. This activate particles is an enumerator where we say if warp active is true, we want to activate the warp, else we want to disable it. To activate it, first we say warp speed VFX.play, which is our VFX graph. And we also want to make sure that in the beginning our VFX graph is stopped, just like this. So if it is active, we play. If it isn't, then we stop it. Now let's create a local variable, an amount, which is going to get the current amount of the warp speed.getFloat warp amount. This warp amount, this variable right here, the slider that is going to control the warp speed effect. And then we say that while amount is less than 1, we want to increase the amount by a certain rate, which is a public float, that we can say it has a default value of 0.02, a very small value. And then we can set the warp amount of our VFX graph to be that amount. And we are using an enumerator, so we can wait a tiny fraction of time, like 0.1, and we wait by saying yield return new wait for seconds. This is the refresh rate, by the way. Okay, so every time we press the space bar down, it activates, but we also want to disable it once we stop clicking the space bar. So we use get key up, and we say warp active is false. and we can copy and paste this start coroutine line. So if warp is not active, we can copy and paste this down here. Since we want to decrease the warp amount to 0, we are going to say that while amount is bigger than 0, we want to remove a certain rate to that amount. That's the only thing we changed. Now down here we can say that if amount is less or equal than 0 plus rate, we want to set the amount to 0. And we want to set the warp amount to that amount, which is 0. And this warp speed VFX.stop, we are going to put it right here. Alright, looking good. Now we also need to make sure that when we start, the warp amount is 0. And make sure that down here is while amount bigger than 0 and not bigger or equal. And we do this while warp is not active, and up here we do this while warp is active. Let's save this, let's go to our scene. And now the idea is to use this script in an empty game object. I'm going to create one. I'm going to parent the VFX graph and set it in the exact position I had before. And then we can drag and drop our script to this empty game object. For the warp speed VFX, we can assign this VFX graph. And that's it. Once we press play, if we press and hold the spacebar down, we activate the warp. As you can see, the warp amount goes up and down according to the spacebar. The particles slow down, which is what we want. The spaceship is slowing down, basically. Now, to add a few more details, we are going to need Blender. We need a cone, a very simple cone. You can open up Blender or any other 3D software, create a cone, right? Then press Edit to enter in edit mode, remove the top and the bottom faces. It's going to be open like this, and then select the bottom faces, shrink them down to something small like this, and then the UVs, we are going to open a new window. And as you can see, we need to push this down. I'm gonna make sure I turn this on and also constraint image bounds, so it doesn't go outside of the UV area. I'm gonna push this vertex down. We can save this blend file directly to our project actually. And before going back to our Unity project, we can press spacebar and search for smooth, and we want to click on shade smooth. It was like this, we want it to be smoother, like this. Looking nice. Back to Unity now. We can drag and drop this to our empty game object, and the idea now is to put this cone in the exact same position as our particles. Just like this. I'm gonna stretch it a little bit. Once you get that in the right position, we want to create a shader. With right click, we want to create an unlit graph. Right, I'm gonna open it up, and we can actually go ahead and create a material that we can assign to our cylinder, so we can see our changes taking action directly in the scene. Right, so the first thing we need is to change the surface to transparent, and then the blend to additive, and turn on to sided. You can save it now, and we are going to need a parameter, a color parameter. In HDR mode, set to white as default, and then we can create a texture 2D, which we are going to call main text. And I'm going to select this noise texture. If you want to have access to it, I left a link in the description where you can download it for free. Now let's drag and drop this main texture right here, let's sample it and connect it to our color input of the unlit master. And as you can see in our scene, nothing changes because we need to assign the noise texture. And now we can see it in action. Now the idea is to make this scroll, and we are going to create a time node and then a vector 2 called main speed. You can multiply these two together, and then we need a tiling and offset, so we can scroll this by connecting it to the offset input and connecting this to the UV input of the sample texture. We get a very interesting effect right away. Multiply this with the color, so we can control the color of our texture. And then we can use a power node to control the dissolve amount, which is going to be a vector 1, just like this, default value of 1. Once you connect it in this way, then you can save it, and in the inspector now you will have control over the dissolve amount of your main texture. Very cool, looking very nice. You can then select the color. I'm gonna choose a blue color, it adds a nice touch. Alright, that's looking very nice. Now, the way we control this shader via script is by multiplying this with a vector 1, called active, which is going to be a slider between 0 and 1. I'm gonna push it up here, by the way. And then we can connect it right here after the power node, just like this. Let's save it. And as you can see, this will control the shader effect basically. Now if we go back to our script, what we can do is create a public mesh renderer, call it cylinder for example. And the way we access that active parameter is by saying cylinder.material.setFloat open brackets active underscore common 0. This active underscore is not going to be the name of the property but the reference, just like this. It's important that they have the same name. So make sure to save the shader. So we set it to 0 in the beginning. Then the easiest way to do this is to copy this active particles function, paste it down here, call it something like activate shader. We can remove this play, and we can replace this by saying cylinder.material.getFloat open brackets active underscore, right? Everything is going to be the same. We are going to replace this by cylinder.material.setFloat this time. Set float active underscore to this amount. Then we can copy this, paste it down here. It's the same thing. And we can also copy this and paste it down here and down here. And then we can remove this stop in the last line. And we can copy this and paste this and change the name so it's activate shader. And we can do the same thing for when we stop holding the space bar. Right, so we are using the same techniques we used for the VFX graph particles. We are simply controlling a variable that goes from 0 to 1. Now, in the inspector we want to assign our cylinder right here. And once we press play, as you may notice, the shader starts right away, while the particles are still a little bit too far. To fix this, we can say down here in activate shader, yield return new wait for seconds and wait for a certain delay, which is a variable that we are going to declare here as a public float with a default value of around 2.5. And actually this wait for seconds is going to be inside the warp active. We don't want to delay the fade out of the shader, we just want to delay the fade in. Right, so let's save this script, go back to our scene, and once we press play, after 2.5 seconds, we can see the shader taking action and getting brighter and brighter. We can actually delay it to 3 seconds. Yeah, that looks much better now. And then it fades out very nicely and everything blends in really well. So that's the basic idea for a warp speed effect. What I did then was adding a chromatic aberration and control it basically in the same way I have controlled the other values. I also added a camera shake and then the spaceship too. But that's basically it. If you want to know how to set up the chromatic and the camera shake, let me know in the comments. In case you want to support me or simply get access to these files and even more projects, I left a link in the description to my Patreon page where you get so many visual effects and shaders that you can use in your game that it's really great. I really recommend you to check it out. I left the link in the description. A special thank you goes to my patrons. All of you are very important and really matter a lot to me. We are now going to have polls every 2 weeks to decide which video or which project is going to be next, which is awesome. And a special shout out goes to the super mega patrons, to the top tier patrons, which are Angel R Dev, Goblin Plague, Hero Syndrome the Game, Himera SPC, JD Sale, Josh McCormick, Remediola, Ken Lee, Kojo Puni, Luo Chang Chen, Marco Rossi, Regan Naidu, Tamari S, TK, Victor Nathan, Xor, and Ilya Zimov. So that's it guys, I hope you have all enjoyed this video and I really hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.